Nicholas Nickleby, Chapter 31, by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. This recording by Patty Brugman. Nicholas Nickleby, Chapter 31. Of Ralph Nickleby and Newman Noggs, and some wise precautions, the success or failure of which will appear in the sequel. In blissful unconsciousness that his nephew was hastening at utmost speed of 4 good horses toward his sphere of action, and that every passing minute diminished the distance between them, Ralph Nickleby sat that morning occupied in his customary avocations, and yet unable to prevent his thoughts wandering from time to time back to the interview which had taken place between himself and his niece on the previous day. At such intervals, after a few moments of abstraction, Ralph would mutter some peevish interjection, and apply himself with renewed steadiness of purpose to the ledger before him. But again and again the same train of thought came back, despite all his efforts to prevent it, confusing him in his calculations, and utterly distracting his attention from the figures over which he bent. At length Ralph laid down his pen, and threw himself back in his chair, as though he had made up his mind to allow the obtrusive current of reflection to take its own course, and, by giving it full scope, to rid himself of it effectually. "I am not a man to be moved by a pretty face," muttered Ralph sternly. "There is a grinning skull beneath it, and men like me, who look and work below the surface, see that, and not its delicate covering. And yet I almost like the girl, or should, if she had been less proudly and squeamishly brought up. If the boy were drowned or hanged, and the mother dead, this house should be her home. I wish they were, with all my soul." Notwithstanding the deadly hatred which Ralph felt towards Nicholas, and the bitter contempt with which he sneered at poor Mrs. Nickleby, notwithstanding the baseness with which he had behaved, and then was behaving, and would behave again if his interest prompted him, towards Kate herself, still there was, strange though it may seem, something humanizing and even gentle in his thoughts at that moment. He thought of what his home might be if Kate were there. He placed her in an empty chair, looked upon her, heard her speak. He felt again upon his arm the gentle pressure of the trembling hand. He strewed his costly rooms with 100 silent tokens of feminine presence and occupation. He came back again to the cold fireside, and the silent dreary splendour, and in that one glimpse of a better nature, born as it was in selfish thoughts, the rich man felt himself friendless, childless, and alone. Gold for the instant lost its lustre in his eyes, for there were countless treasures of the heart which it could never purchase. A very slight circumstance was sufficient to banish such reflections from the mind of such a man. As Ralph looked vacantly out across the yard towards the window on the other office, he became suddenly aware of the earnest observation of Newman Noggs, who, with his red nose almost touching the glass, feigned to be mending a pen with a rusty fragment of a knife, but was in reality staring at his employer with a countenance of the closest and most eager scrutiny. Ralph exchanged his dreamy posture for his accustomed business attitude. The face of Newman disappeared, and the train of thought took to flight all simultaneously and in an instant. After a few minutes Ralph rang the bell. Newman answered the summons, and Ralph raised his eyes stealthily to his face, as if he almost feared to read there a knowledge of his recent thoughts. There was not the smallest speculation, however, in the countenance of Newman Noggs. If it be possible to imagine a man with 2 eyes in his head, and both wide open, looking in no direction whatever, and seeing nothing, Newman appeared to be that man, while Ralph Nickleby regarded him. "How now?" growled Ralph. "Oh," said Newman, throwing some intelligence into his eyes all at once, and dropping them on his master. "I thought you rang." With which laconic remark Newman turned round and hobbled away. "Stop," said Ralph. Newman stopped, not at all disconcerted. "I did ring." "I knew you did." "Then why did you offer to go, if you know that?" "I thought you rang to say you didn't ring," replied Newman. "You often do." How dare you pry and peer and stare at me, sirrah?" demanded Ralph. "Stare!" cried Newman. "At you! Ha! ha!" which was all the explanation Newman deigned to offer. "Be careful, sir," said Ralph, looking steadily at him. "Let me have no drunken fooling here. Do you see this parcel?" "It's big enough," rejoined Newman. "Carry it into the city, to Cross in Broad Street, and leave it there, quick. D'ye hear?" Newman gave a dogged kind of nod, to express an affirmative reply, and leaving the room for a few seconds, returned with his hat. Having made various ineffective attempts to fit the parcel, which was some 2 feet square, into the crown thereof, Newman took it under his arm, and after putting on his fingerless gloves with great precision and nicety, keeping his eyes fixed upon Mr. Ralph Nickleby all the time, he adjusted his hat upon his head with as much care, real or pretended, as if it were a brand new one of the most expensive quality, and at last departed on his errand. He executed his commission with great promptitude and dispatch, only calling at one public house for half a minute, and even that be said to be in his way, for he went in one door and came out at the other. But as he returned, and had got on so far homeward as the Strand, Newman began to loiter with that uncertain air of a man who has not quite made up his mind whether to halt or go straight forward. After a very short consideration, the former inclination prevailed, and making towards the point he had laid in his mind, Newman knocked a modest double knock, or rather a nervous single one, at Miss La Creevy's door. It was opened by a strange servant, on whom the odd figure of the visitor did not appear to make the most favourable impression possible, inasmuch as she no sooner saw him than she very nearly closed it, and placing herself in the narrow gap, inquired what he wanted. But Newman merely uttered the monosyllable "Noggs," as if it were some cabalistic word, at sound of which bolts would fly back and doors open, pushed briskly past, and gained the door of Miss La Creevy's sitting room before the astonished servant could offer any opposition. "Walk in, if you please," said Miss La Creevy in reply to the sound of Newman's knuckles, and in he walked accordingly. "Bless us!" cried Miss La Creevy, staring at Newman, bolted in. "What did you want, sir?" "You have forgotten me," said Newman, with an inclination of head. "I wonder at that. That nobody should remember me who knew me in other days is natural enough, but there are few people who, seeing me once, forget me now." He glanced as he spoke at his shabby clothes and paralytic limb, and slightly shook his head. "I did forget you, I declare," said Miss La Creevy, rising to receive Newman, who met her half way, "and I am ashamed of myself for doing so, for you are a kind, good creature, Mr. Noggs. Sit down and tell me all about Miss Nickleby. Poor dear thing, I haven't seen her for this many a week." "How's that?" asked Newman. "Why, the truth is, Mr. Noggs," said Miss La Creevy, "that I have been out on a visit, the first visit I have made for 15 years. "That is a long time," said Newman sadly. "So it is a very long time to look back upon in years, though somehow or other, thank Heaven, the solitary days roll away peacefully and happily enough," replied the miniature painter. "I have a brother, Mr. Noggs, the only relation I have, and all that time I never saw him once. Not that we ever quarrelled, but he was apprenticed down in the country, and he got married there, and new ties and affections springing up about him, he forgot a poor little woman like me, as it was very reasonable he should, you know. Don't suppose that I complain about that, because I always said to myself, it is very natural. Poor dear John is making his way in the world, and he has a wife to tell his cares and troubles to, and children now to play about him, so God bless him and them, and send we may all meet together one day where we shall part no more. But what do you think, Mr. Noggs," said the miniature painter, brightening up and clapping her hands, "of that very same brother coming up to London at last, and never resting till he found me out? What do you think of his coming here, and sitting down in that very chair, and crying like a child because he was so glad to see me? What do you think of his insisting on taking me down all the way into the country to his own house, quite a sumptuous place, Mr. Noggs, with a large garden, and I don't know how many fields, and a man in livery waiting at table, and cows and horses